Many of you have probably seen this photograph. And what is the object John is holding in the photo? What is it?
Watermelon.
That's a watermelon. Now, it's not an urn, it's not a, what country was that in?
Greece.
Greece. So that's a greasy watermelon. Okay, anyway. If you would like to have a few words, if you'd like to say something, give us some remembrances of John or a little bit, now's the time. I believe I'm going to pick on, where is Jane? Yes, there she is.
The obnoxious person with the camera.
The obnoxious person with the camera. Jane?
Well, I had the pleasure of knowing John for probably maybe 3-4 years, and he was such a joy. He had such a spirit of life, and he loved to just have fun. And one example that comes to mind, downtown Mount Dora, there's this really awful sculpture of John Lennon, and it's on a bench, and he's sitting there with arms outspread, and it's really, John hated it. And one thing that bothered him was the hands were straight up like this instead of slightly tilted so that the rain would run out when it rained, so the rain collected. And he said this was just didn't make sense. But John Lennon had a pair of glasses that he would wear. They were metal framed glasses, and someone had taken them. So John and I got the idea of we would supply it with sunglasses. So we went to Walmart and we got, I don't know, a couple of dozen of sunglasses, took them back, and in the dark of night, we would come and put sunglasses on and see how long they would last before someone would take the sunglasses. Then we would go back and we'd put another pair. And we kept doing this, and we don't think anybody knew that we were doing it, but we had a lot of fun doing that, and just gave us, and he would take pictures and send me the pictures on his phone, and so it was a lot of fun. And that just is kind of an essence of who John was. And I miss him from my life. He was a wonderful person to have long conversations with on a myriad of subjects. And I will remember those and treasure those. And I am sorry that he exited as soon as he did. He's a hole in my life. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Sonia Watson, and John was a very, very dear friend. I miss him tremendously. He would come I make jewelry, and he would come into my studio on a daily basis. And so that certainly is a gap that's never going to be able to be filled again, and I miss him greatly. She says, I don't think I will be able to make John's memorial, but I do want to share one thing about John that I often share with others and that often resonates with me as I walk around the museum or think about conservation needs for the collection. One day, John came to the museum to look at one or two things, and as always, I asked him about 1,000 questions that had nothing to do with what he came for or for what he was being paid to do. He would stay for hours. He always kindly gave me more than twice the amount of advice than he was obligated to do. I will probably never find anyone like that again. Anyway, as we walked around, we looked at some of the bronze pieces that were discolored, and we talked about the climate control and humidity in cases and how that can cause the discoloration, the humidity inside the cases. He then said that a big cause of problems with bronzes in galleries is caused by people coming into the museum with wet coats on. And yes, old people with flatulence issues. Is this true? Either way, he didn't even crack a smile, but it always sticks in my head. And when people ask me about discolored bronzes, I always struggle not to smile and say that it's caused by too many farts in the galleries. I will never forget this. Thank you, John, for being my friend and for loving the collection as much as I do. Laura.
I met John, well, it was a few years ago. I was one of his students at the glass workshop at Sedoni, and I have to say it was more fun than work. Many memories of Swandoni on the lake, sitting on the porch, and just gracious family that welcomed us with open arms. Actually, I'm here to represent a friend of his, Stephen Koob, who's a conservator for Corning, and I'd like to read what Steve sent me, if you don't mind. It says, my celebration of John. John was my good friend and one of my best colleagues in conservation. I remember when he first came to me in Athens over 35 years ago, so they have a long history. He was a student wanting to go into conservation, and I recommended the Institute of Archaeology in London. He went on to make a good name for himself in the field, and finally here in Florida, as you all know, from your museum and the Morse Museum. He always helped with the glass conservation course at Sedoni, and he just heard from many of his former students. But even more, he was always fun, and I do remember that. I was just reminiscing with Jennifer about running around his mother's house, fluorescent glass one night during the course. It was like Halloween. And good-natured. Many fond memories spent with John, and Steve says he always remembers John tricking his two boys about a large alligator down at the lake and setting up a little prop for them and scaring them half to death. I can see that. And Steve just wishes he could be here. A lot of fond memories, a lot of camaraderie.
Thank you.
One time, we actually stumbled into the Morse Gallery while John was actually working on the chapel there. And we said, boy, this is so cool. And so, you know, he was like on his hands and knees, like, you know, doing the stuff there at the bottom, you know, towards the front there. And, you know, we just looked at it for a second, we went, John. Nothing. John. Nothing, you still. John. John. Nothing. Nothing. The guy was like so totally focused on what he was doing. You know, he had like, I don't know how many billions of little pieces of tile he was doing, but he just was not going to stop. Or you know, he was just in a zone there, and I guess you just can't do something like that unless you can also have that kind of focus. I don't think I ever told him that story, but we were pretty amazed that a person could do that, and I still am.
Thank you.
My name is Donna Kleiman-Haig. I'm one of the curators at the Morse Museum. John actually was moved into the back of our old museum, which was the storage area. And at that time, I think some of the family members were helping him too, but they laid out every inch, every mosaic piece of the chapel and slowly reconstructed it. The whole entire interior, every inch of it, every mosaic had to be cleaned twice with distilled water and Q-tips. So it was a very, very comprehensive, time-consuming job. And when he moved in with the objects, he didn't stop working. He just worked and worked night and day, or if he was more inclined to be sharper at night, he would do it at night. So, and he would run up to my office and say, "Did you see this? This is great." And you know, he wanted to show me that as the columns took shape with the mosaics going in place, they all represented a cruciform. And that was great. And then look at these mosaics, because they're not just a slab of glass, they're all sort of layered glass. And there were things that you would never see on your own. You would never know. And then John, even after that, when we had lunch several times in the last 6 months, he told me stories just about Zelwood and Mount Dora and all you folks. And he was pretty special.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, in 1 minute, tell us what the Morse Museum is.
The Morse Museum is the most comprehensive collection of the work of Louis Comfort Tiffany. And so we have something that Tiffany created in all medium, plus a lot of archival materials and glass plate negatives and reproductions, not reproductions, but reproduced photographs from his original glass plate negatives that he tended to take with his own camera, Louis Tiffany that is. So we have the most comprehensive collection. It might not be pin for pin, the largest collection, but then I don't know that it isn't, but it is the most comprehensive collection of good study material. How's my time?
Thank you. You did exactly right. I appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Tom Watson. I didn't know John for too long, but I knew him long enough to realize what an incredible resource he was, not only for knowledge and information about where we live, about anything historical, but he was just an amazing friend. He was so, as you all know, he was so loyal, so devoted. A little story, a little personal story, and then I have something from one of his oldest friends to read. I went to Hampton-DeBose Academy. I lived there for 4 years, which is now where John's parents live, Sedona. And my sister went there as well, so she came to visit. We stopped, I called up John, I said, can we drive by the house? My sister wanted to see it from the outside. He said, sure, come on over. I'll check with my mom, it'll be fine, come on over. So we got there and stopped the car. John said, come on, I'll show you inside. An hour and a half later, we knew all there was to know about the place. And not only as it is now, but all its history, where it came from. As anybody who's talked to John knows, he could do that. You know, he could tell you minutia that you never knew you didn't know. And it was an amazing experience. And every conversation I had with him was like that. He knew so much about this part of Florida, about the people who originally came here, and you know, just an incredible guy. And on a personal level, he was such a good friend. It was a real honor to know him. Now what I want to do is read to you this letter, which came from a dear friend of his, one of his professors. The actual letter's up there on the bulletin board, but it's 3 pages long, so this contains some stuff that probably some of you don't know about John, and a lot of it really sheds a lot of light on his character, so here we go. This is from Bill Murray, and it starts off saying, this was written in a gush of emotion on 2 days, October 30th and November 1st, just after I received your email regarding John's celebration ceremony scheduled for November 4th. Unfortunately, I'll return from Greece the day following this event and thus cannot be at the celebration. I still felt the need to express my feelings for John in writing. So, I'm going to read this. One thing I want to say before I start this, I forgot. November 2nd, in Mexico they have a tradition, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, called El Dia del Muerto, which is the Day of the Dead. On November 2nd every year, they honor those loved ones who have passed on, and they do it by picking out their favorite foods and setting them up at a feast, and they expect that on November 2nd, El Dia del Muerto, the loved ones will visit them. And that's what we're doing here for John today. That's why all the Twinkies are over there, all the candy, all the stuff that John loved. And we know his presence is here with us today. So this is from Bill Murray. I first met John in the fall semester of 1982 when he was a student in my first class at USF titled Classical Greece. I don't remember the specifics of our first meeting, but we hit it off immediately. Here I was, fresh from grad school in the wilds of Florida, wondering if anyone would want to study ancient history. Thank goodness John was in my first class. He caught my attention to the point that I encouraged him to join me on an expedition to the Mediterranean during the summer of 1983. We'd first start out by excavating the harbor of Herod the Great at Caesarea in Israel, and then move our base to Greece, where we work on documenting submerged ancient harbors in a region called Acarnania. For me, the trip was a dream come true. I had received a generous grant funding, had a job, and now a genuinely interested student. The deep affection my wife Suzanne and I have for John began in earnest on this trip in June and July of 1983. With his practical know-how, his can-do attitude, and his quirky sense of humor, John built a place in our heart that lasts to the present day. Most of the photos I have of John are from this period, and they all reveal a young man who was having a ball. During a recent visit to his house in August, John showed me with pride one of the pictures he had framed and hung on his wall. It was from 1986, a few years after this first trip to Greece, and he was sitting on an overgrown corner of Augustus Victory Monument for the famous Actian War, fought in 31 BC between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra. He was wearing a white suit of clothes with a broad-brimmed hat. Stickum Maseman, he told me. What? I asked. He said this is how he thought of himself during this period. I presumed he meant some sort of eccentric uncle who was off exploring the world. I see the same John in the picture that accompanied the Celebrate invitation. That's this picture here. John of Arabia, or Expeditionary John. He was just old Stickum when he was young. When I told him I had recently run across more pictures of him from this period, he told me he'd like some copies because he wanted his kids to know this side of him. So during the recent It's All About John event, I brought 5 or 6 prints to give to him, and I watched him light up as he described to others the escapades of old Stickum a quarter of a century before. Over the years since that first trip to Israel and Greece, my wife Suzanne and I have watched with pride as John went through the program in archaeological conservation at the University of London, then returned home and started a family. I never saw him enough, but he always made time to see Suzanne and me as he traveled the state, creating a network for his conservation business. For me, he was a font of practical information that I could tap when I wanted to know the properties of a certain glue, how to remove a stain, or how to protect a certain kind of fabric or paper from sunlight. He always knew or could direct me to someone who knew. Now that he's gone, I feel as if the internet node labeled practical knowledge has been shut off. It makes me sad just thinking about it as I sit here in the Athens airport, waiting for a flight to the very region where I showed John so many years ago. Everyone I knew always pronounced John a nice guy. I never met anyone who disliked him, not one. Perhaps it was because he was playful on the surface, yet thoughtful underneath. Let me give you an example. John was on a survey project as a co-conservative that I had directed in 1988. Suzanne was pregnant with our son Alex and was sick as a dog. It was her first trimester. She had bad morning sickness, and to top it off, she had been advised by a doctor in Athens to stay in bed. So there she was, sick, bored, and scared, in bed during a heat wave that sent the temperature well into the 100s. The only thing that appealed to her was ice cream. So John made it his mission to get her a cup of ice cream every night from the local kiosk. A daily cup of ice cream cemented a lasting friendship between the two. The act was simple, touching, and powerful. In subsequent years, it became apparent to me that Suzanne would have walked over coals for John, if necessary. I never met someone who was more generous with his time than John was. When Suzanne and I bought our first house, John came to Tampa for a weekend to help us build a porch over the little slab of concrete that the builder had left out back, baking in the sun. I knew nothing about framing and calculating the pitch of the roof, about screening, or about laying shingles. As a result, John did the bulk of the work, putting up with my bumbling attempts to help. When we were done, however, I joined him in proudly signing our names on one of the roof beams where no one could see it from below, although by rights, John's name should have been there alone. We sold the house long ago, but I pass by once in a while just to see that John's porch is still there. It is, and I presume our signatures are too. As for John signing things, I remember that whenever he'd come to visit, he'd make sure he marked his birthday on all of our calendars. On November 25th, there was always a notation, John's birthday. Sometimes we'd call and sometimes not, but he made sure that we knew we should be thinking about him. And we did. I now miss the periodic calls I'd received from him. He'd always start the same way. Hi Bill, it's John Maseman. In sort of a fast, clipped cadence. Whatever I was doing, I set it aside because a chat with him always left me more informed about something. I'd learn about the history behind Sidoni, about Zellwood, about some new book treasure he'd found on the internet, about some new conservation technique, or about something related to my research that he'd spotted in some magazine. Although I often told John how much I admired him, how good a father I thought he was, how caring a person, how level-headed he tried to be during the down times in his life, and how much Suzanne and I treasured his friendship, I wish I'd been able to talk to him one more time to express these feelings before he passed away. And that's why I'm writing as I sit here waiting for my flight. I feel he would be at his celebration. and I want him to hear it again, how much Suzanne and I admire him. He needs to hear one more time how much we cherish our friendship with him, having known him. I don't remember the first time I saw John in class, but I do remember the last time I saw him, and he looked thoroughly happy, thoroughly appreciated and loved. Those of you in attendance today made him feel that way, and I thank you for it. I called him a day or two after a day or two after the It's All About John event, and I found him tired, but still in great spirits, looking forward to a trip to the beach with Todd. I hear that all the kids eventually went. I'm sad as hell when I think that John is gone. I can't tell you how many times I've caught myself picking up the phone to call him to ask him how his treatments are going, and then I catch myself, and I'm overwhelmed with a hollow emptiness. But then, I pull up the pictures from the It's All About John night, and I look into his eyes, and I see a proud father and a happy community member who was surrounded by caring, loving friends. I'm still sad, but that night gives me a great happy memory to ponder. I then pass to the old photos I have of a much younger John, whose period as my student marked my own early years as a teacher. I remember the quirky things John did, and then I smiled. Like when he presented me with a replica of an amphora that we'd found during our 1983 summer survey in Greece. When I gushed over it, he told me he'd made it in his grandmother's kiln from a lamp bulb. Then he got a glint in his eye and told me how he'd like to make a forearm with a hand and a hand with a finger extended, you know, like the outstretched arm of an emperor's honorific statue. He'd paint it gold. What archaeologist doesn't want to find a buried golden statue? And then he'd bury it, finger pointed upward in the middle of an excavation trench for something important to find. A few years later, he did just this at Caesarea. He made the statue fragment in the States and then buried it just beneath the surface in the trench of the project's director. Now this guy had always joked about finding a golden statue with an outstretched arm, and when he came on John's artifact, I'm told he almost flooded his mask because his golden statue was giving him the finger. Of course, John has extended the middle finger. The imp in John's character still makes me smile. I'm now in the western Greek city of Ioannina. It's gloomy and cold on a rainy day, and I'm thinking about a much younger John who brought a pack of Habitanta cigars with him on his first trip here. We were walking up to a hilltop fortress with a local shepherd as our guide, and John offered him a cigar when we stopped at a spring for water. The shepherd lit it up and smoked the thing like a cigarette, drawing the smoke deep into his lungs. Halfway through, he stood up and resumed the trek up the mountain, exhaling clouds of smoke as he set off, a man 20 years our senior, leaving us behind in his wake. A bit further up the trail, we smell the odor of the beech wood tip burning. He still puffed a few times and then took it out of his mouth. "You got another?" he asked John. I'd always get John going when I reminded him of this story. It was one of our favorites, so I feel you need to hear it too. I wish I could be with you this afternoon to hear some of your stories about John. It would do me good and make me feel better. I also have a few questions I'd like to ask his sisters and mom. Here's one. Did John really graduate in flip-flops? I think he did. I recall attending the event, but now I need someone to refresh my memory. I should mention that John's the first one I ever saw who wore flip-flops and a tie. Happy John, helpful John, fun-loving John, our friend John. Long before Christianity, the ancient Greeks felt that immortality consisted of being remembered by those who lived on. Pause, traveler, as you gaze at my tombstone and know that I too was once happy and alive, reads one of the inscribed slabs I saw recently in Greece's National Museum. John's immortality is definitely secure with me, and I dare say with everyone here today. I urge John's children to hang on tight to the good memories they have of their father. If you do, he will live on to a ripe old age. He'd like that. He deserves that. Don't let him go. And don't forget his birthday. Especially think of him on his birthday, November 25th. It's on all my calendars.